Hello, my name's Christopher Joel, and if it wasn't for the COVID-19 virus, I'd be in the Higgins Museum standing in front of you, and Sarah Flynn would probably be introducing me. But as we are where we are, I'm going to have to do that for myself. Well, I'm a former lifeguards officer turned military historian who, a couple of years ago, was introduced by a mutual friend to another former guardsman, the publisher and author Sir Anthony Weldon. That's him on the right. It quickly emerged that we were both working on similar projects. After an initial discussion, we agreed to combine forces, and the result is The Drum Horse in the Fountain, which is now available on Amazon. Our original intention was to profile just 100 men, but in the end, we've covered the lives of more than 300. We made our choices from the rich seam of guardsmen who, during their lives, did some pretty remarkable things. By the way, there's a bottle of champagne for the first person who can correctly name all 9 men on the right of this slide, all of whom are in the book. Anyway, our objective was to both shine a light into some long-forgotten corners of our military history and to correct some widely held myths. The most common of these myths was given a public airing on Irish radio by Lord Mandleson, who, while Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and doubtless trying to curry favour with the Southern Irish audience, said in answer to a question about the Queen's birthday parade, "Oh, it's a lot of chinless wonders in bright scarlet uniforms, marching around Horse Guards Parade, doing quite incomprehensible things with flags." He was quickly rebuked in the letters column of the Daily Telegraph by a retired soldier who wrote that in his experience, Guards officers were rarely chinless and mostly very remarkable. The author of that letter was not a fellow Guards officer, but Colour Sergeant John Keneally, Victoria Cross, of the Irish Guards. But his story, which is itself very unusual, but takes quite a long time to tell, will have to wait. Instead, I'm going to give you a brief taste of some of the characters in our book drawn from the final lineup, which includes, working clockwise from top left on the slide, the brave, the pious, the distinguished in many fields, the eccentric, the downright criminal, some animals, and a category that can only be described as reserved for incorrigible rogues. By the way, there's another bottle of fizz on offer for correctly naming all of the characters on this slide. So let's start with the brave. Of the 1,355 individual recipients of the Victoria Cross, 44 of them have been guardsmen, including John Keneally, whom I've just mentioned, and some of the very first awardees shown here in this slide. One of the 44 guardsmen to be awarded the Victoria Cross was Field Marshal the 6th Viscount Gort, whom Lord Mandleson would undoubtedly have dismissed as a chinless wonder. During the First World War, in addition to a VC, Gort was also awarded no less than 3 DSOs, an MC, and was mentioned in dispatches 8 times. A professional soldier from an old Anglo-Irish family, Gort was commissioned into the Grenadier Guards in 1905. The time of the action which resulted in his winning the Victoria Cross, he was an acting Lieutenant Colonel in command of the 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards, the leading battalion of the 3rd Guards Brigade. The citation for his Victoria Cross makes chilling reading. Under heavy artillery and machine gun fire, he led his battalion with great skill and determination to the forming up ground, where very severe fire from artillery and machine guns was again encountered. Although wounded, he quickly grasped the situation, directed a platoon to proceed down a sunken road to make a flanking attack, and under terrific fire went across open ground to obtain the assistance of a tank, which he personally led and directed to the best possible advantage. While thus fearlessly exposing himself, he was again severely wounded by a shell. Notwithstanding considerable loss of blood, after lying on a stretcher for a while, he insisted on getting up and personally directing the further attack. By his magnificent example of devotion to duty and utter disregard of personal safety, all ranks were inspired to exert themselves to the utmost, and the attack resulted in the capture of over 200 prisoners, 2 batteries of field guns, and numerous machine guns. Hardly the action of a chinless wonder. Another Guardsman who shows up Lord Mandelson's slur for what it was is Captain John Brooks of the Irish Guards. Born in London in 1898, at the outset of the First World War, John Brooks was impatient to fight and persuaded his stepfather to get him, despite being underage, a commission in the Irish Guards. One of his fellow officers was Lord Edward Fitzclarence, the great-grandson of King William IV, who lent Brooks, then usually known as Brookie, a scurrilous novel called The Adventures of Dolly Varden. After leafing through a few pages, Brooks threw the book to one side, saying, "I can't waste my time reading that rubbish." "Oh, Dolly!" exclaimed Eddie Fitzclarence. From that moment, the nickname Dolly stuck to him for the rest of his life. In 1925, Brooks exchanged his bearskin for a cowl, becoming a Benedictine monk at Downside Abbey. However, when general mobilization was declared on the 4th September 1939, Dolly immediately applied to rejoin the army as a padre, and in 1942 he was posted to the 1st Battalion Irish Guards as their Catholic chaplain. 9 months later, the battalion landed in Algiers and began the long fighting march to the Jebel Bou Azoukaz, the last mountain range before German-held Tunis. The Bou, as it is still referred to by the Irish Guards, was the scene of intense and bloody fighting over several days, during which John Keneally won his VC, and Father Dolly, armed only with a blackthorn, not only captured 6 German soldiers, but also displayed the most extraordinary courage. As the following extract from his citation for the award of the MC states, "There are no words strong enough to express the shining example Father Brooks gave to all ranks. He has been in places where the fire was impossibly heavy, and yet has given comfort to the dying without any thought for his safety. An almost unbelievable devotion to duty and bravery, never appearing too tired to go to the furthest points to help a wounded man. The sight of Father Brooks pacing up and down reading his breviary under heavy fire has restored the confidence of many a shaken man." Father Dolly modestly makes no mention of winning the MC in his memoirs, although he does refer to the capture of the Germans, saying Mass before each attack, and taking confession in the field whilst pacing up and down. Father Dolly later claimed that his reading of the breviary was not a troop morale-boosting exercise, although that was the effect that it had, merely his duty as a priest. He did, however, admit that it was good for his own morale. The list of distinguished Guardsmen includes scholars, scientists, doctors, composers, authors, poets, artists, lawyers, actors, film directors and producers, politicians, heads of state, and, as shown in this slide, 2 winners of the Oscar for Best Actor and several prime ministers. And there's a 3rd bottle of champagne for naming all these men. But this list is typified by Colonel the Honourable Aubrey Herbert, another Guardsman whose reputation should make Peter Mandelson blush, and whose story allows me to cover off the eccentrics at the same time. Aubrey Herbert was the step-brother of the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, the man who funded the excavation that uncovered the tomb of Tutankhamun. Despite seriously impaired eyesight from birth, he was keen to fight in the Second Boer War, but was deemed to be medically unfit. Instead, he joined the diplomatic corps, working as an attaché in Constantinople, which imbued him with a love of the Balkans and resulted in his fluency in Turkish, Arabic, Greek and Albanian, in addition to his command of French, German and Italian. Herbert's diplomatic career came to an end in 1911 when he was elected to Parliament as a Conservative. His seat in the House of Commons did not, however, prevent him from making frequent trips to Albania, where, thanks to his progressive views on Albanian independence, he was offered the throne. Tempted to accept, in the event he refused the crown, but he did not break with Albania, working tirelessly for the country's independence and having the distinction for an MP of being accompanied to the House of Commons by a pair of armed Albanians in native costume. With the outbreak of war in August 1914, Herbert was again refused a commission on medical grounds, but nevertheless joined the Irish Guards as an ensign. He did this by the simple expedient of buying the regiment's service dress uniform and then, without any enlistment paperwork, joining the embarkation parade and boarding the ship on which the battalion was being transported to fight in France. Wounded and briefly captured during the retreat to Mons, in December 1914, military sense prevailed and Herbert was transferred for the duration to the Arab Bureau in Cairo. Once in Cairo, he met and befriended T.E. Lawrence, the future Lawrence of Arabia. Herbert's own post-war career was no less eccentric than his wartime activities, as he consistently refused the Conservative whip and instead voted on legislation with whichever party his conscience dictated. He also, once again, refused the offer of the Albanian crown. But this was not the full extent of his eccentricity, for he took to dressing as a tramp, a disguise heightened by his near blindness and piebald hair. Finally, when advised by his former Oxford tutor that his blindness could be cured by having all his teeth extracted, he did just that. The blood poisoning which he developed in the aftermath of this crackpot council resulted in his early death in 1923 at the age of just 43. From the eccentric and gallant Aubrey Herbert, I now want to introduce you to a four-legged guardsman, before closing this short introduction to the drum horse in the fountain, with the tale of one of our soldiers who was a crook, a rogue and a hero, all rolled into one. Now some of you may know that the Irish Guards have a wolfhound mascot who appears on parade with them. One such was Crucken of Ifold, who was acquired by the Irish Guards in 1924 and lived as part of the family of the commanding officer, Colonel Pollock, until 1931, when events took an unfortunate turn. By now a dog of advanced years, Crucken had taken to attacking other pooches when out for his morning walk in Hyde Park. All might have been well had not the wolfhound selected as his next victim a greyhound belonging to the fascist Italian ambassador, whom he savaged but did not kill. Colonel Pollock takes up the story. "Well, I had to attend the Italian embassy to apologize. His Excellency arrived and I did so apologize. A few weeks later the Italian dog was again being exercised in Hyde Park, when Crucken made a dive for the dog and killed it. After that, Crucken had to do his exercises in Battersea Park, and the next time the battalion were in Aldershot, I had to take him to the sick lines, and he was painlessly destroyed." Which brings me to Guardsman Eddie Chapman, who was a handsome, if rather raffish-looking individual with a talent for making money in dubious circumstances and then spending it on wine, women and song. These were not obvious qualifications for service with the Coldstream Guards, whose 2nd Battalion Chapman joined in 1930 while still under age. His service with the colours was to be relatively short-lived. After 9 months he went absent without leave, during which time he hid out with a girl he'd picked up in a Soho bar and with whom he had then spent a happy 8 weeks sampling the delights of the London underworld. This idyll was cut short by the military police and was followed by 84 days in a military prison and a dishonourable discharge. Following his release from the glass house, it wasn't long before the utterly amoral Chapman was back in Soho, where he developed the criminal speciality of safe-breaking with explosives, while supplementing this income, thanks to his undoubted charm and good looks, with some lucrative and pleasurable sexual blackmail. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, the ex-Coldstreamer Chapman was in a Jersey jail serving a sentence for safe-breaking. Back in London, he had an abandoned wife, several current girlfriends, a warrant for his arrest as one of the most wanted men in England, and a probable 14-year prison sentence. He was still in prison in St Helier when the Germans invaded the Channel Islands in June 1940, an eventuality which Chapman regarded as a godsend because, on completion of his Jersey sentence in October 1941, it was next to impossible that he be sent back to England to face the law. This proved to be the case, and for several months following his release, Chapman ran a hairdressing business in St Helier, which also acted as a front for black marketeering. This criminal interlude came to an end when Chapman realized that he was under German surveillance as a possible member of the resistance, which he wasn't. His answer to this threat was to apply to German HQ to act as a spy. However, instead of being recruited, Chapman was arrested and deported to a grim prison camp where he languished until the end of 1941. But Chapman's espionage application had not been forgotten, and after a series of SS interrogations that focused on his expertise with explosives, Chapman was transferred into the care of the Abwehr, the German Army's intelligence service, who gave him an intensive period of training in all the arts of the spy and the code name of Fritz. Unbeknownst to the Germans, Fritz's existence as a potential saboteur had been picked up by the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, top left-hand corner of the slide, and from the decodes, MI5 knew that Fritz would soon be heading to England on a mission. They even knew that his real name was Chapman, although they failed to identify him as Eddie Chapman. This was a failure which Fritz quickly corrected on the night of the 16th of December 1942, when he parachuted into East Anglia and immediately handed himself into the security services with an offer to work for the British. In one of those coincidences which litter the pages of our book, the policeman who accompanied Fritz to an MI5 office in London recognized him immediately. They'd served together in the Coldstream Guards. Over the weeks which followed, Chapman was extensively debriefed, interrogated, finally accepted as a potential double agent, and given the code name Agent Zigzag, all the while, under MI5's close supervision, reporting back to his German masters on the preparations he was making to complete his mission, which was the destruction of the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, where the Mosquito fighter bomber was made. In order to maintain his cover, MI5 put together an elaborate deception plan to convince the Germans that Fritz had accomplished his task. It succeeded, and he was recalled to France. By March 1943, Zigzag had arrived by boat at the neutral port of Lisbon, from where, accompanied by Abwehr minders, he travelled to Paris via Spain after staging another fake act of sabotage, directed by MI5, but on behalf of the Abwehr. There followed a lengthy debriefing and interrogation by the Germans, who were naturally suspicious that Fritz had been turned. Once the Germans had convinced themselves that Zigzag was still a loyal Nazi, he was moved to Norway, where he was presented with the Iron Cross, the only British national ever to have received one in wartime, a large sum of cash, and provided with a fully funded life of leisure that extended to him having a live-in Norwegian girlfriend and a sailing boat. But all things come to an end eventually, and in March 1944, Zigzag's German minders flew him to Paris, gave him a spectacularly liquid send-off at the Hotel Lutetia, and then dropped him by parachute into Cambridgeshire, tasked with a long list of intelligence objectives. After a very uncomfortable flight, during which his aeroplane was hit by flak, and a hard landing on a road, before which in mid-air he'd vomited up his farewell lunch, Zigzag handed himself in and once again was subjected to an extensive interrogation. Such is the fate of a double agent. Of the tasks that had been set by the Germans, only one was completed, with the active assistance of MI5, and that was the false reporting of V1 impacts. Zigzag's war came to an abrupt and somewhat ungracious end in November 1944. The problem for MI5 was they really didn't know how to disconnect securely from Zigzag whilst at the same time preventing him from working for another, albeit friendly, security service. He'd already been given an immunity from prosecution for his pre-war criminal exploits, and he had a stash of cash, but other than that, Zigzag was a potential loose cannon. In the end, he was tricked into signing the Official Secrets Act, and then on the 28th of November 1944, summarily sacked. The Germans, meanwhile, were more loyal and proposed recovering him to lead a post-war resistance group. Chapman held no grudges and simply returned to a life of crime which paid him well enough to own and drive a Rolls-Royce, although he didn't have a driving licence, wear handmade suits, buy a castle in Ireland and a spa hotel in Hertfordshire. In the post-World War II period, Chapman, who described himself as an honest villain, was occasionally arrested and charged, but never convicted, thanks to character references provided by MI5 that stated he was one of the bravest men who served in the last war. That story brings me to the end of this short introduction to the Drum Horse in the Fountain. I'd like to thank you for watching, and I very much hope that I'll be able to give you an expanded version in person in the Higgins Museum. If that's not possible, then I suppose we can always get together on Zoom.